Good morning. Happy Saturday. Welcome to Cowboy Church, live from Las Vegas, Nevada. Vern and I came out here to watch the Run for the Million Cow Horse edition last night, the Cow Horse Challenge. And tonight will be the main event, the reigning. They have $1 million in the purse tonight. I think first place takes $500,000 home. So we're really excited about that. Last night, man, they really lit it up here in the Cow Horse Challenge. And Corey Cushing, I'll give you kind of the rundown. Corey Cushing on Hot Rod brought down the house with a storming fence run to take the lead, which he never gave up. And he won it. And second place, Chris Dawson on CSR Lay Down Sally. Third place, Philip Rawls on Call Me Mitch. And Aaron Termino on Hazardous Material. She was fourth, but in the reining, she laid down a 2:29 1/2. It was really awesome. And I thought she was going to run away with it. And she had a good fence work at a 2:19, I think it was, but there was just some monster fence runs last night. So it was pretty exciting. It's great for the sport of reining cow horse. And I think it's going to just keep growing from here as part of this event. So we're here having a good time. Tomorrow morning, I can't do Cowboy Church because we'll be traveling back home. So thought I'd do a little Cowboy Church right now while we have some peace and quiet here in the hotel room. So welcome. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Father, I trust that when you said that when two or more are gathered in your name, that there would you be also. So I just ask that you bless all who maybe are watching live, who will watch later on in the week, who are maybe accustomed to me coming on live on Sunday morning. I trust that as they find you, that you will bless them, not because of me, but because of what you might speak to their heart through your spirit. So I know there's prayer requests all over the country, people that I know, people that I hear of. I don't want to mention anybody by name, but I know that we need to send prayers out to Kentucky and Oklahoma and down to South Florida, Ohio, so many places, people watching in, maybe people I don't even know about. Just ask that their requests be heard. And we know that you are serious about having a personal relationship with each one of us and want to hear our concerns and hear our needs. We ask it in Christ's name for your glory. Amen. So, yeah, whenever two or more are gathered, we've been talking about the church and what the church is and what the church is not, and maybe some of our conditioning about the church that needs to be reevaluated. To me, church, whether it's in a beautiful ornate building with hundreds or perhaps even thousands of people, whether it's two guys sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck talking about the things of God, or maybe around a campfire, or casual conversation in the grocery store with someone that maybe is an old friend or someone you don't even know, maybe someone on an airplane. I really believe that's where the rubber hits the road, where God is at work. He's lively when two or more are gathered in his name. That amazing things happen. And that's really what the church is all about. We actually carry the church within us. So when we don't go to a church building to be with God. The scripture says that he literally puts his spirit within us. We carry him around wherever we go, and his spirit is active, and it wants to engage other people. and he networks us. I look at the church kind of sometimes like this huge spider web, and two people over here interact, and miraculously, two people down here are affected by it. The web jiggles over here, and someone feels it over here, and God's connecting all of us together. Literally, as Paul said, he connects all the joints and the marrow and the sinews of each of us, which create his living body here on earth as his ambassadors to this world. So we're studying more about the church, but I want to go to this morning just for my own studies. I've been looking at the tabernacle that God instructed Moses as leader of the nation of Israel when they were in the desert, in the wilderness, under Mount Sinai, after they had left the Egyptian bondage, been in bondage in Egypt for over 400 years. And they were promised the Holy Land, but they were on their way. They had not reached the Holy Land, and they would be 40 years, a whole generation out in that desert. And God instructed Moses to build this portable structure, for lack of a better term, a tent, but it was very elaborate. And you can read about it. I've been studying it in the book of Exodus. And you can go on your phone and Google the tabernacle. And it'll show you images of how this tabernacle or portable meeting place was to be constructed. And I'm just going to read you in Exodus 25, the first couple of verses in that chapter. And it says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel that they bring me an offering of every man that giveth it willingly. With his heart you shall take my offering. And this is an offering which you shall take of them: gold, silver, and bronze, in blue and purple and scarlet, and fine linen, and goat's hair, and ram skins dyed red, badger skins, and acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for anointing oil, and for sweet incense, not incest, incense. Onyx stones and stones to be in the ephod and in the breastplate. And he goes on and on and on about all these expensive and fine materials that were to be collected from among the families, the children of Israel, the whole family, the generations. Now, when they had left Egypt, there was some 1.5 million people. And the Egyptians were anxious to get rid of them. And the Egyptians gave them stores of all these materials and a lot of livestock, a ton of livestock: goats, sheep, horses, oxen, cattle. And they had all of this with them out in the wilderness. They had fine linen. Linen, I had to study, well, where does linen come from? I didn't really know. And it comes from the flax plant. And the flax plant has these long fibers, and they would split these fibers and then weave them into fine thread, and then on a loom make cloth called linen. So they had all these materials, and they were carrying them around in the wilderness. And the Lord told Moses, take up an offering and get all the materials that are necessary to build this portable structure, which will be the meeting place where I will meet with the representatives of the representative of the people. And that's how we will interact. So they built this tabernacle. And the tabernacle had several different parts. The first part that you would encounter as you approach the tabernacle would have been the outer court. And the outer court was constructed, it was like a wall or a fence. I think it was about 15 feet high. They measured everything in cubits. And if you're reading this and you're wondering what a cubit is, the cubit was the length of Pharaoh, the Pharaoh in Egypt, from the tip of his middle finger to his elbow. And it's about 18 inches. So 10 cubits would have been 15 feet high. And this wall around this outer court, excuse me, was made of linen. And it was constructed, they had poles every so often. And the poles were made out of acacia wood. And they would encase these poles in silver and in gold. And then they had these linen panels that were stretched between two poles and connected to each other by eyelets and rings made of gold and bronze. And this whole tent, so to speak, or this outer court, this outer barrier, was constructed in this way that it prohibited you from just walking in and out of from the movable tent community into this outer court that surrounded the place where God would meet the representative of the people, which was called the holy place. So this outer court was 150 feet long, east to west, and 75 feet north and south. So it was a pretty good size area. And there was only one way to get in. There was a gate on the end, and it was guarded. And only men could come in there. And the only reason that you could come in there, if you were not one of the priesthood, was to bring an offering. And when you came through that outer gate, the first thing that you would encounter would be this huge, for lack of a better term, barbecue pit made of bronze, which is called the altar of burnt offerings. And they would bring in the prescribed offerings that you can read about here in Exodus and on into Leviticus. And they would bring in these offerings to be made, and they would sprinkle the blood of the slain animal on the altar, and they would burn the various pieces of the meat on the altar. And then as you proceeded past the altar, you would come to this large basin called a laver of cleansing, and it contained water for ceremoniously cleansing, and the priests would use this. After the laver of cleansing, there was another tent, and it was more ornate, made of more costly materials. There was a lot of gold, a lot of silver, and they had fabric made of animal skins that were dyed purple, blue, and red. And all of these colors and the various materials and fabrics that were used to construct this whole portable tent structure, each one of them had a specific symbolism. The theologians call these types that all pointed to the future. They were prophetic in nature. They represented types or shadows of things to come. And we will see that those shadows were all shadows of the Messiah, the Christ. They all pointed to the future when the Christ would come. They all had a particular meaning. Now, like you can look at a shadow, like if you're out in the bright sun and you're wearing a cowboy hat, you can look on the ground and see your shadow, and you can see for certain that it's a person wearing a cowboy hat. And depending on the angle of the sun and the time of the day, that shadow can give you a more accurate representation. For example, you may not know if that shadow is cast by a man or a woman, depending on the angle of the sun and the time of the day and the angle of the way the person's turned. The point is, it's a person. You may know that it's a male or a female, but there's always a distortion. The reality is not fully understood until you see the person from which the shadow was cast. And that person in this case is Christ. So these are shadows of things to come. They give you an idea of what's going to happen and what we can expect. But the reality is not fully known until you see the actual object or person that casts the shadow. So this whole tent structure was a shadow. So after you pass this laver of cleansing, this wash basin, you would be confronted with another structure, as I said, more ornate, more expensive, and that was called the holy place. And I think it was like 45 feet east to west and 30 feet north to south. So again, it's about the size of a medium-sized home. And there was an outer opening there where only the priesthood can enter. And when they came inside, they would be confronted by more pieces of furniture, more objects. There was this table of showbread. There was a golden lampstand with 7 lamps, which looks like a menorah. In the Jewish faith, the menorah would be what this lampstand looked like. And then there would be an altar for burning incense. So they would burn incense continually to send up a sweet smell to God, make God feel comfortable and at home. Outside they had barbecue cooking, and the scriptures talk about burning the meat and the fat, and I imagine that sent up a fantastic aroma. Obviously, the labor of cleansing would represent being clean in God's presence. And so the priest would go in there and they would make their offerings, table of showbread, but then they were confronted by another obstruction called the veil. And the veil hid the most inner compartment of this portable structure, this portable tabernacle. And that inner compartment was called the Holy of Holies. And inside the Holy of Holies, it was where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And the Ark of the Covenant was like grandma's old cedar chest. It was made of acacia wood, which is similar to cedar, and it was totally inlaid with gold. So it was the gold completely encased the acacia wood, and it was very ornate and had a lid that could be removed. And inside this chest, the ark, were the 10 Commandments and a couple of other objects. For example, Aaron's rod that budded that you can read about in Leviticus. And that was kept inside this Ark of the Covenant. And when you put the lid back on the Ark of the Covenant, which, by the way, only the high priest could go in there. On top of the lid were these 2 golden angels that represented cherubim that protected the Ark of the Covenant from any intrusion. And to even go in and look at the Ark of the Covenant, unless you were the high priest, was a death sentence. And once a year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest, who was of the lineage of Levi. That's why the book of Leviticus is all about the priesthood. Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, also known as Israel. And only the men of the lineage of the son Levi could serve in the priesthood. And the office of the high priest was handed down from firstborn to firstborn through their generations. And once a year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go in and he would bring offerings and meet with the Spirit of God, known as the Shekinah glory. And they would see this pillar from outside of the enclosure, outside of that 150 by 75 foot linen curtain. The whole 1.5 million of the children of Israel would see the Shekinah glory settle down on top of the Holy of Holies, and inside the Spirit of God would meet, literally sit on that mercy seat. And if the offering for that year's cumulative sins of the entire nation was satisfactory, God would bless them and forgive their sins for that year. If it was unsatisfactory, the high priest died. And that represents, thinking about that, sitting on the tailgate of my truck, I'm thinking, well, if he died, what did they do? I mean, who's going to go in there and get him? Well, what they did is they had bells around his priestly robe. And as long as they could hear those bells jingling, they knew that he was still alive. And they would tie a rope around his waist so that if those bells stopped jingling, they could haul his carcass out of there. And then the next guy in line, he would become the high priest, the next son. Like, man, oh man, I don't know if I want that job, Dad. That sounds pretty dangerous. I'm thinking practically about all this. Like, that's why, when Moses became the reluctant leader of the nation of Israel, he complained to God. He said, I don't want this job. The people are pushing me. They basically said, Moses, you go up on Mount Sinai and see what he wants. Man, how would you like to have been Moses? You either have to go up on Mount Sinai and face God Almighty by yourself, or you have to go back down the mountain and put up with 1.5 million murmuring Jews saying, Moses, what are we going to eat? Moses, where are we going to get water for us and all of our livestock? Moses, my neighbors are driving me crazy. We're all living in tents out here in the desert. He's under miserable conditions. 1.5 million of them bitching at Moses. And Moses was caught in the middle of a hurricane there. Anyways, so that's how this tabernacle was constructed. But I really want to focus in on, well, let's talk a little more about it, because, I mean, again, practically speaking, well, if no one could go in and even look at the Ark of the Covenant, except for the high priest, how did they tear down this whole, I think of it like the circus, when the circus comes to town, it's miraculous how they come in and they have this huge tent, just the fabric alone, just think how heavy all that is. And all those huge poles, all the things they need to set up this huge circus tent. And this whole structure was like 150 by just the outer court, 150 by 75, with all the associated poles that were 15 feet high, and all the associated ropes and stakes that were needed to anchor all this stuff down in the wind of the desert under any conditions so that it didn't, up and blow away. Can you imagine the fabric around the holy place and the Holy of Holies in a desert sandstorm blowing away and exposing the Ark of the Covenant, that could not happen. So this was quite an operation. But how did they move the Ark of the Covenant? Well, there was rings in the side of this chest made of gold, and there was these long poles they called staves that slid through the rings and would stick out to the sides of the tent, so that without taking the tent walls down, they could get a hold of these poles, and men could pick it up and they could move it. And they were actually able to move the Ark of the Covenant on these poles with the tent covering still covering it, so no one could be exposed to the most holy of holies, because men were not allowed to come into the presence of God. So they had the Holy of Holies, and surrounding it was the holy place, and surrounding that was the outer court. And as you approached God, there was obstacles all along the way. The altar where the offerings were made. And if you pass the altar would be the laver of cleansing. Somebody had to bring the water, fill that thing up. And past that, another obstacle to get into the holy place. And the common folk were not allowed in there. The common folk, just the men only, were allowed in to the outer court, but only to bring the offerings. That was the domain of the priesthood, the younger priests. And the younger priests were the ones that supervised the sprinkling of the blood and the cutting up of the different parts of the animals. And that's how they were fed. And there was also offerings of grain for the bread. There was offerings of wine for the drink. There was offerings of what else did they have? Oil. They needed oil for the making of the bread and oil for the burning of the lamps. They supervised all those offerings. There was offerings for their priestly garments, and the various priests had more ornate garments, and they had certain they had these breastplates with jewels encrusted in them, and all the jewels meant certain things. They were all types. Everything meant something. Everything pointed to the future. Everything pointed to Christ. Now, this went on for hundreds of years until finally King Solomon, once the Israelites had settled in the Holy Land, King Solomon, who had amassed huge wealth in his conquest, because when they moved into the Holy Land, there were inhabitants there that were in the way. And in displacing these inhabitants through various wars, wealth was accumulated. And Solomon had used this wealth to build a permanent structure, which was really just like a scaled replica of the original layout of this portable tabernacle, which Moses was instructed and that we read about here in the book of Exodus. And it was a permanent structure. And it stood for hundreds of years until the nation of Israel was conquered and ransacked, and all of the children of Israel were carried away into Babylonian bondage as slaves for several more hundred years. And then they would finally come back and reconstruct this temple. And that temple was based on the same format, the same blueprint that we see here in Exodus, with the tent structure, same blueprint. And that structure stood until the time of Jesus. So when we read about Jesus going into the temple, that's the temple built in Jerusalem by the same blueprint that Jesus would have entered. And that subsequently was destroyed about 75 AD. Jesus had told his disciples, as magnificent as that structure was, I mean, every year at Passover, every Israelite had to come to the temple in Jerusalem. They had to make a pilgrimage. And some of them had to walk many, many days to get there. And it was like, it was the nation's capital. And that's where God meant the high priest, the representative of the people. And the high priest would enter in to that Holy of Holies through this veil that separated God from the people. It prohibited access of God to the people. If you wanted to have a relationship with God in those days, you had to go through the high priest. And if you wanted to have a relationship with the high priest, you had to go through the lesser priest. There was a definite hierarchy. Now, today in our mind, we still think it's the same way. And that's the point of today's message. We still think based on those shadows of how things would look like today. We still think that in order to have a relationship with God, we have to go through a priest. And if we really want to get close to God, the closest we can get is to go to the high priest. You have to have access through the hierarchy. And that little old me really doesn't have any access much at all. That's what I want to talk about today, because that's the picture that's in our minds. If we want to have a relationship to God, we have to go to some holy place, some holy building, some holy structure. We have to get access through the outer court. And once we get through the outer court, perhaps we might get a glimpse of the holy place, but we certainly wouldn't have access to go in the holy place. So if we need to get a message through, we have to somehow send it through some messenger, some priest, to take our request into the holy place and give it and hand it off to the highest of high priests, who would have direct access to God and hopefully deliver our message, and that our message would be blessed and returned to us. Let's turn to the New Testament in the book of Matthew and read about some of the events that occurred on the day of Christ's crucifixion. And we'll pick this up in Matthew chapter 27. And you can also, there's corresponding accounts of Jesus' death in all four of the synoptic gospels. So you can read about it in Mark 15, Luke 23, John 19. And also some comments in Hebrews that we'll go to, that were written by the Apostle Paul after the fact, based on his personal experiences with Jesus and the eyewitness accounts of those who were present that day and saw this for themselves. So I'll pick it up in Matthew 27, verse 50, when Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and he yielded up his spirit. That was when he had pronounced, "It is finished. It is finished." And he yielded up his spirit. And there's two ways that you could interpret that phrase, Jesus' last words here on earth as a man, "It is finished." You could interpret it as, I'm done for, all is hopeless, it's over. Or you could interpret it as, I did it. Everything that is necessary has been accomplished. And now it's not over at all. We've just begun. It's a brand new beginning. That's how I choose to interpret it. Everything that's necessary has been accomplished, and there's a brand new beginning, a brand new life. We're born again. We're born anew. In verse 51, it says, and behold, and listen to this, the veil of the temple was torn in two. In the Old King James, it says it was rent asunder. Kind of poetic language. It was torn in half. From the top to the bottom. And the earth did quake, and rocks were split, and graves were open, and many bodies of the saints that slept were raised. They've been born again, born anew. But the point I want to focus in on today is that it says the veil that separated man from the holy place, the Holy of Holies, was torn in two from the top to the bottom. As if God had taken that veil and he just ripped it apart. And he says, come on in. Come on in. You have access to me now. There's no barrier. There's no partition wall between you and I. And you and I can enjoy a personal, intimate relationship with one another. You no longer have to go through a priest. It was a fulfillment of another prophecy that was given by Jeremiah in chapter 31, when he announced the terms of a new covenant that God would make with his people. Let's go there and read that. We've got a little time. Jeremiah 31 in the Old Testament. Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet. Isaiah, Jeremiah. Here we go. We'll start in verse 27. It says, behold, check this out. Listen to this. The days come, saith the Lord, that I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of men and with the seed of beasts. And let me go further on. Let's go to 30. In the interest of time, let's go to verse 31. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in that day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband to them, saith the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel, and after these days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, or every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, saith the Lord. And I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sins no more. He says, this is the covenant I will make. He says, first of all, you won't have to try to memorize those commandments of the Old Testament, starting with the 10 Commandments, because I'm going to write it on your heart. He says, you're not going to have to ask your neighbor or your brother how to know the Lord. What he means by that, and that reference to brothers, is that there were 12 tribes of Israel, 12 brothers. The tribe of Levi were the priests. He said, you don't have to go find a priest to know the Lord. You're not going to have to go see some holy man, for all will know me, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. I take that as like, what he's really saying is that I want to have an intimate personal relationship with each of you. And just as much as you're my people, just as much as you belong to me, guess what? I belong to you just as much. I think that's an amazing statement. It's like he's saying, I really want to be your best friend. And I'm removing every obstacle that gets in the way of that, including the law and the commandments. That was a barrier between us. And I had to put up a veil so that you didn't just stumble in there and kill yourself. But now, through my son Christ and his redemption on the cross, we've torn that veil. There's no partition that gets in the way. And that's why in Hebrews, I think Paul wrote Hebrews. We don't know for sure. But no matter, in Hebrews, I want to read you something here. Book of Hebrews. And he's writing this to the descendants of the children of Israel. But it applies to all of us, and I don't have time to get into the scriptures that prove that. But it says in Hebrews chapter 4, the last verse of the chapter 16, it says, "Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in our time of need." Now remember, inside that Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And on top of the Ark of the Covenant was where God would come and meet with the representative of the people, the high priest, and they called it the mercy seat. And through this whole section of the book of Hebrews, the author is proving that we have a new high priest after the ancient order of Melchizedek, which was the office of the high priest going all the way back to Adam, before the Levitical priesthood was instituted. So even before we read about the Levitical priesthood, way before that, there was a high priest that was superior to the Levitical priesthood. And when Jesus came and literally was baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist, that Levitical high priesthood was reestablished. And it goes on and it says that way in the book of Hebrews, is saying we have a high priest who has gone into the Holy of Holies. He's sitting right there at the right hand of God in heaven right now. And he's advocating on our behalf, saying, those are the ones, Dad. Those are the ones. These are our people. These are the ones that we belong to. And he's welcoming us in and said, you can come in here boldly. I look at it as like we have access to God 24/7. And we can just barge into his office, run up to his throne like little children and jump up in his lap. And he drops everything he's doing and focuses all of his attention on us. Because he knows that we belong to him, surely, but that also he belongs to us. And he wants to have an intimate relationship, just like a loving father with his little children. Just tickled to death with us. And there's nothing in the way. Jesus removed every obstacle. So therefore, I invite you to come boldly before the throne of grace and enjoy God's presence, and enjoy a relationship, a loving relationship with him, and actually be able to hear his voice and follow his leadership, trusting that he has already written his laws in our hearts. And he understands. that we're living in sin-cursed bodies still in a sin-cursed world that is falling apart. But that's not a barrier. That's not an obstacle for him. He's not sitting there waiting for us to clean ourselves up at this laver of cleansing in the outer court so that we can be presentable. He says, no, in spite of the fact that you're living in sin-cursed bodies in the sin-cursed world, I have removed that veil. Come boldly. So I want you to think about that this week. And Werner and I are going to go over to the South Point Hotel and Casino and check out the trade show. And this afternoon they're having extreme bullfighting. The rodeo bullfighters will be there. And then they're having the non-pro run for the million. And then the capping event for the weekend will be the open run for the million in the reining. We should see some sliding and spinning tonight. So until then, God bless, happy trails, and we'll see you next week.